Back, and you're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm your host, Garland Nixon, here with my co-host, Dr. Wilmer Leon.
Thank you, Garland.
The FBI's attack on the Uhuru African People's Socialist Party comes to a head this September as the trial of the Uhuru 3 begins. Joining us to discuss this, we have Dr. Gerald Horne. He's a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, and researcher. Dr. Horne, welcome to the Critical Hour.
Thank you for inviting me.
Orinoco Tribune, we have a statement by the Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition and Venezuela Solidarity Network. The Nicaragua Solidarity Coalition opposes the U.S. government prosecution of the Uhuru 3 as agents of Russia. This is a very, very important issue. Dr. Horne.
It certainly is. And I think it's important to recognize the stakes that are at issue and at play. What I mean is that the African People's Socialist Party is trying to carry on, and indeed escalate, a long tradition of Black American solidarity with the real or imagined enemies of the U.S. ruling elite in order to gain leverage for material concessions to improve the life chances of the African American community. This goes back to the colonial days. Recall that when Florida was under Spanish rule, you had Africans enslaved in Georgia who were fleeing to St. Augustine, Florida. And in fact, the most significant revolt of the enslaved in the colonial period in South Carolina in 1739 was basically engineered in no small measure by Black soldiers in the pay of His Catholic Majesty in Spain. Then, of course, we know that when the United States so-called patriots, led by George Washington, revolted against British rule in 1776, we know that the Black population did not stand alongside George Washington in significant numbers. They stood against George Washington, the enslaver, and the same thing happened in 1812 when Britain invaded the United States and helped to burn down the White House in August 1814. They were assisted by enslaved Africans. We know that during the bloodiest wars the United States was involved in before the Civil War, the war against the indigenous in Florida, the so-called Seminole Wars, that once again, the Black population stood alongside the Seminoles. And then where this current persecution of the African People's Socialist Party is where the rubber meets the road is in the 20th century, when you have the Bolshevik Revolution, the Russian Revolution, 1917, which helps to shift the global discourse from race to class. We see that the sterling members of the Black community, led by Paul Robeson, stood by Moscow. And of course, you know that he helped to file a petition at the United Nations in 1951, charging the United States with genocide. And we know that the socialist camp, led by the then Soviet Union, supported that genocide petition. And we also know that in the following decades, when you had liberation movements in Angola and Southern Africa and South Africa fighting against apartheid, fighting against European colonialism, they were armed to the teeth by the then Soviet Union. And this kind of contradiction is continuing to this very day. We have taken note of the fact that the U.S. anti-war dissident, Scott Ritter, his home was raided by the U.S. authorities, not least because he's a stern opponent of the U.S. escapade in Ukraine. And I think it's important to recognize that it's not only that the Uhuru 3 and the African People's Socialist Party are standing in a grand tradition of Black American dissidents. The wider question is, who will stand by the Uhuru 3? Who will seek to emulate the Uhuru 3 as we strive for better life chances for the Black community more generally?
As we look at, and you just laid out an incredible historic record, as we look at the pushback or the response by the government over concerns of sedition and other types of acts, they tend to to rise during times of war when the United States feels that it's the most threatened. And then once the threat is vanquished, then those concerns seem to relax. So how much of this do you think is the reality of a threat perceived by what the Uhuru movement is doing, which is no threat at all, versus laying the groundwork for just an all-out assault on the First Amendment?
Well, I think you're onto something when you suggest that U.S. imperialism is feeling ever more nervous as U.S. imperialism assesses the international landscape. There's the rise of China, for example, and it's surging ahead in green energy, quantum computing, for example. There is the rise of the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, which will be meeting in Russia within weeks, expecting to entertain membership applications from countries as important as Malaysia, perhaps Algeria, and Indonesia as well. And then there are the wider threats that U.S. imperialism faces as a result of the reputational damage that it has had to endure as a result of standing by the piratical regime in Israel. This has caused many to wonder, most recently, why it was that at the Paris Olympics, there were obvious sanctions placed upon Russian athletes, for example, but why no sanctions against Israeli athletes, for example? This kind of double standard is hardly compatible with the global correlation of forces as we speak. And obviously, this is of maximum concern to U.S. imperialism. And I should add that one of the factors that oftentimes is lost sight of, but has been the subject of a number of recent books by honest U.S. scholars, is that there is a discernible rogue element in the national security establishment in Washington, D.C. If you just take a brief look at the history of U.S. imperialism, look at, for example, what happened during the Korean War when U.S. General Douglas MacArthur wanted to launch World War III by attacking the People's Republic of China and the Soviet Union and was sacked as a result. Look at the fact that the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the top military, they oftentimes do not take minutes with regard to their meeting. As a result, when we see episodes like January 6, 2021, it's easy to conclude that this is not a matter of happenstance, that when the military stands down, when they're summoned to the Capitol to put down an insurrection, that that's not necessarily a coincidence or an accident. And so we see that we will face, I'm afraid to say, going forward, ever more adventurous and audacious rogue elements in the national security establishment, precisely because U.S. imperialism is facing real and, in fact, also imaginary threats.
And to further that conversation, the gray zone, two plotters of the assassination of Haitian President Jovenel Moise were exposed as DEA informants. Another was unmasked as an FBI informant. It appears that U.S. intelligence, the dark hand of U.S. intelligence was involved, Dr. Horne.
The only question there, once again, is whether or not they were authorized at the highest levels, or whether or not, once again, this continues the theme I've introduced of there being rogue elements. Whatever the case, the fact is that for centuries, there has been fury and anger in Washington directed at the Caribbean island that is Haiti. After all, the Haitian Revolution disrupted the cash cow that was enslavement of Africans, leading to a general crisis of that entire system, including the United States, that could only be resolved with this collapse. We also know that the United States is deathly concerned about controlling the untapped vast natural resources of Haiti. We also know that historically, for decades, even during a time when the late, great Frederick Douglass was the chief U.S. envoy in Haiti, the United States was concerned about securing a military base in Haiti, which has become all the more important because of its proximity to socialist Cuba. But once again, when you look at this current scandal with regard to the DEA and the FBI, it's difficult to separate it from the fact that Washington, in addition to being riddled with rogue elements and rogue elephants, is also riddled with corruption. I'm sure you gentlemen took note of that article in the Washington Post about the Trump team in October 2016 receiving millions in unmarked bills from the authorities in Cairo. And then General al-Sisi, the strongman so-called of Egypt, was one of the first guests in the Trump White House. The fact that Egyptian agents, once again, were implicated in the recent corruption conviction of Senator Menendez of New Jersey, who was forced to resign after gold bars, amongst other goodies, were found in his closet in his palatial residence in New Jersey. And so the question we need to ask further with regard to the scandal in Haiti is the connections in Colombia in particular, and whether or not this is also a backdoor way to fund elements in Colombia that could challenge the regime of President Petro and perhaps could even reach further south to challenge the regime of President Lula in Brazil.
So, with just a couple minutes left and staying on Haiti, many thought that by now there would have been a real groundswell of response from Haitians in response to the Kenyans landing ashore, but that we haven't really seen that yet. What are your thoughts there?
Well, I'm afraid to say that the Haitian masses have been subjected to massive propaganda from the Colossus of the North, speaking of the United States of America. The Haitian masses, of course, have been traumatized by the tumult in recent years, including the assassination in his bed of the leader, which we've just made reference to, not to mention the reign, or I should say, the fact that on the streets of the major cities, you have paramilitary organizations whose allegiances are rather murky and unclear. And so we should stay tuned, however, because the Haitian masses have a justified reputation for being in the forefront of anti-imperialist struggle, anti-neocolonial struggle, and I dare say that the last word has yet to be spoken.
Dr. Gerald Horne is a professor of history at the University of Houston in Texas. He's an author, historian, and researcher. You're listening to the